The global car industry is facing another crisis. After Brexit, the pandemic and the semiconductor shortage, now the invasion of Ukraine. There are concerns over a shortage of gas used in making semiconductor chips after two key suppliers in Ukraine shut operations.
Neon gas is needed to produce the chips which are used for cars. David Bailey is Professor of Business Economics at the University of Birmingham.
So neon gas is a colourless, odourless, inert gas, which sounds pretty dull, but it's hugely important in making chips, semiconductor chips, not fish and chips. So semiconductor makers, they get big slabs of silicon called ingots. They slice them up into wafers, a bit like these CD discs that many of us will remember from years ago, and then they engrave them. And the lasers that they use to engrave them very precisely are controlled with neon gas. So the chip makers need neon gas to carve their chips and actually make them happen.
Now, I think last time you were on the programme, you said the chip shortages are expected to last for years, not months. I wonder which companies are most affected, and how does that manifest itself as a car buyer?
So I think the entire industry is now affected. There was a hope that towards the back end of this year, supplies of semiconductors would increase as new capacity came on. The problem now is that two big companies in Ukraine produce 50% of the sort of chip-grade neon that is used. So the big chip makers, some companies like Samsung, Intel, TSMC, they've probably got a few months of stocks left. But at exactly the time that the car industry hoped that chip supply would improve, I think this will start to impact. So it's going to look at really prolonging the supply shortage into next year, and the entire industry is getting affected. So those companies that have done reasonably well, companies like Hyundai and Toyota that had good links with chip makers, even they're starting to get affected. So the entire industry will be affected.
You have to spare a thought, don't you, for those running the international car companies. I mean, we have the semiconductor crisis, COVID, Brexit, and now Ukraine. I mean, it couldn't be more challenging.
No, we've used the term before, a perfect storm, but that's how it seems. And in a sense, if you think about it, the car industry has globalized. It now has long supply chains that, cross the world many times. And you only need a catastrophic event, whether it's bad weather or political instability or war, and that impacts on the supply chain. So I think that's what we're seeing, lots of different things impacting on the car industry going forwards. And they're having to react to that in terms of reducing production, really focusing on high-value models in order to get the maximum return from their really constrained supplies that they have.
I'm guessing if it's so difficult to make new cars and supply new cars, that's having an impact on the used car market around the world.
It is indeed. And so what we're seeing are record prices for second-hand cars. They've kind of ameliorated a bit in the UK in recent months, but still at historically very high levels. And in some cases, the value of a relatively new second-hand car, less than a year old, in some cases is higher than the list price of a new car, simply because you can get it straight away. So unprecedented situation in the second-hand car industry with a big increase in prices, to the point where I recently sold one of my old cars, an old MGTF, and I actually made money on it. Usually you lose money on buying and selling a car. In this case, prices had gone up so much, I actually made money. So really unusual situation in the second-hand car market as well.
If the semiconductor problem is proving so intractable around the world, are manufacturers, designers looking at the possibility of almost going backwards in terms of their design and technology, where cars are not so dependent on all of this difficult tech?
Yeah, I think there's a couple of things happening. One is there may be more supply coming on stream, but chip makers may not come in if they think that this is simply a temporary thing that will get resolved at some point. But car makers are effectively de-chipping their cars. I've got a friend who's a consultant. He's working very actively on this. How do you take chips out of cars? We've seen the likes of Tesla take chips out of various parts of its car, including in terms of full autonomy, whether that will be possible if you take a chip out. In other cases, car makers going away from digital displays to analog displays. I rather like that because I like dials and knobs. So car makers are trying to really economize on chips, use them more sparingly, and in that case, we might see fewer options on cars as they're trying to have to save on chips.